Tonight's session is going to be on actually what I'm working on here. I think I've alluded to it before, but I don't know if I've actually gone into any great detail. But I'm going to give you a rundown of literally like what we talked about today. So I'm going to go through what I and my partners from Jamaica presented to but there was probably about, I don't know, 40 some odd people there, I guess, something like that. And this was all people from various ministries. They call them permanent secretaries here. So if someone is like at the ADM level, assistant deputy minister, so they're like the next in line. There's the minister is political, and then the first person who reports to them in the bureaucracy, in the civil service, is they call them the permanent secretary here. So we had a lot of permanent secretaries from various ministries, as well as ministers. So ministers were launching it and stuff like that. So what I'm going to talk about today is that, and then relate it to the two courses, sustainable development, because it's literally what we're working on, and then also environmental assessment, because this is something that's very closely related to that. All right, so that's the plan for tonight. So I've literally taken, not everything, but a large portion of what I was talking about today and just put it into this presentation so you can get like really just actually what we are doing today in this session, which was, it was cool, it was good. I wasn't nervous at all. I've done enough of this stuff to just kind of flow with it, whereas my partners were a little nervous about it going well, but I thought it went really quite well. So this is a project that I did. So I founded and run a company called DE, as you know, and this is another group. So one thing that you'll find in this kind of work is quite often, as you know, like in your work, I bet you work with several different organizations, NGOs, consortiums, et cetera, et cetera. So in our business, we quite often will partner with different groups, particularly in projects like this when it's done in a different part of the world. So it always is useful to have a regional partner because they just know the territory better, and then it gives you more legitimacy, really, actually, in the region if you've got like rather than just being some Canadian company that's doing work all over the place, you've got regional partners in the country. It looks better, it's just a better thing to do because it shows you're kind of engaged with the local, real kind of grassroots companies and organizations. So it doesn't have to be a company. In this case, they're a company, but it could be an NGO. Right? I always recommend that to people that if you're doing projects in different parts of the world, try and get a local partner because I think it makes things a lot more smooth. And they're great people to work with. So they're out of Jamaica, and their specialty is geoinformatics, GIS. Now, we have specialization in that as well, but they're more on the technical side of programming and stuff like that. And they are a spin-off from the University of the West Indies in the Mona campus. UWI is all across the Caribbean, the West Indies, University of West Indies, and they have different campuses. So Mona is the campus in Kingston, Jamaica. So I've been working with them since about 6 years, I guess, maybe, something like that, and they've been great to work with. So we're doing this project, and one of those logos didn't show up. Interesting, okay. This is the name of the project, St. Lucia Reporting System for MEA Implementation and Environmental Information Management. And we won this project by bidding on it, like most of these things occur, and it's funded. It's for St. Lucia, so St. Lucia's logo didn't show up for some strange reason, but it's funded by a group called the GEF, and the executing agency is UN Environment. This is how this stuff often works: is the funding comes from what's called the Global Environmental Facility, which is one of the biggest funders, donor-driven funding groups in the world for environmental work. So they're like the backstop for the World Bank, for instance. They fund a lot of World Bank stuff and so forth, as well as, they're a part of the World Bank group. So they are providing the financing, the UNEP is looking over this, and then the actual client for us is the government of St. Lucia. We report to a group within their Sustainable Development Department. That's kind of the lay of the land with this. So I'm going to explain basically what this project's all about, and I will interject periodically, and hopefully we can have a discussion about how this, how we're perhaps advancing a strategic environmental assessment, and then what's some utility in the things that we've come up with for environmental assessment at SEA, and then sustainable development in general, particularly in this case, because we're dealing with a small island developing state, right? And so these countries tend to be less resourced, and they tend to be more vulnerable to a lot of the environmental changes that are happening, like, for instance, an increased frequency of high-energy storms and storm events and sea level rise. All of these things are a lot more problematic for a country like St. Lucia than a country like Canada, I'll tell you that. So we were developing this project, which is a reporting system for MEA implementation. And the overall goal of this project was to support stakeholders, so government agencies, NGOs, and the private sector, as well as civil society in general, in improving an environmental reporting system, developing indicator sets, and establishing an environmental information system and related online tools and platforms. That's literally came from the contract to say this is what we want you to do. Specifically, there's 3 MEAs that we are focusing on. The UN Convention for Biological Diversity, CBD, I've talked about CBD before, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, so UNFCCC, and UN Convention to Combat Desertification. So those 3 MEAs are the ones that we are working with them because they're a party to these conventions on reporting. If you're a party to these conventions, you have an obligation to do certain things, to report on and show what you're doing for, say, climate change, mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, etc. So our overall goal is to increase the St. Lucia's capacity to monitor MEA implementation and sustainable development. That's what we're trying to do. So this is our major tasks, what we were focused on doing. Again, this is coming straight from our scope of work. So think of this presentation as something we're delivering to the world. It is. Literally today, I was presenting this with our colleagues to a group of people, some of whom were the clients and some of whom were just on the committee for stakeholders, some of them from ministries, and some from the Minister of Education was there as well. So the first task for us in most of these projects is to get your ducks in a row. Prepare a work plan, and you do what's called an inception report, which is you have a meeting with the client and you go through the scope of work and the contract and say, this is what we're agreeing to do, this is what we agreed to do in terms of the proposal we did to your RFP, this is how we're going to do it, this is the timeline, this is the budget, blah, 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 blah. And then you agree upon that. And the inception report basically is the framework for going forward. Second task was to conduct an assessment of currently reported information against reporting requirements to at least 3 MEAs. So what we did was looked at what they need to do for each one of those 3 main MEAs, CBD, CCD, and UNFCCC, and then see what they're supposed to do and how they've done it, right? So what do their greenhouse gas inventory look like? What does their biodiversity report look like? All that kind of stuff. And then task 3 was to identify priority environmental data gaps and develop plans to address them. So once we've looked at reporting, once we looked at the reporting structure, what they're required to do, what they have been doing, then we looked at how well they've been doing it, right? So for instance, monitoring the levels of invasive species, right? That's a big issue in some countries like this, everywhere, but it's particularly here. And then we looked at, well, how do they report on that? Like, what data are they using? Is it solid? Are there gaps? We did what's called a gap analysis for environmental data for their reporting. We next looked at facilitating the identification of a set of core sustainable development and environmental indicators based on the national priorities, and this is coherent with regional and international indicator frameworks. So this means we talked to, we looked at regional bodies for indicators across the Caribbean, but we also looked at the indicator sets from the conventions. So what does the UN CBD suggest that Canada and all these other countries report on in terms of indicators for biodiversity and ecosystems? Right? So we looked through all of those things and said, okay, well, here we go. These are all the indicators, but here are the core ones. There's ones that are more important than other ones, like land cover change for land degradation. That's a very, very core indicator that you need to have good data for. And then task 5 was then to map national and regional information sources relating to the priority environmental indicators in this in the context of sustainable development. So like once you have your indicators, both the broad set and the narrow set, where do you get the data? So we had to do a big report. These are all reports that will be publicly available. And I'm going to write some articles on this stuff too. Is we looked at, here's the indicators, and then where are you getting data from them, and where could you get data from them? Like say some of which we didn't have data in the country for some of these indicators. So we suggested global data sets, which give you pretty good, and in some cases very good data that you can report on. It's, even every couple of years they'll have fresh data. And then lastly, establish an online platform for sharing and presenting available information and for the MDA indicators. That means building the software, right? So this is essentially what we were tasked with doing. So how did we go about doing this? Like, what's the approach that we chose to take? So this speaks very much to those that are in 660 with respect to how do you approach doing an SEA, or as cumulative effects assessment. First, I kept it kind of casual, like in this presentation. I was wearing a suit and so forth, but I like to bring humor into it and just kind of lighten the tone when we enter, like start the presentation. So I started a joke about, you know, the first time that I came to the Caribbean in 2012, I think, for a project. I was in Belmopan, Belize. I walked in like I would normally walk in for any new project, wearing a suit and tie. And this was with in Belmopan with a group called the 5 Cs, the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, which is a well-known climate change research group in Belize. And I walked into the meeting wearing this, and then in the meeting there was Dr. Trotz, who's one of the most well-respected climate scientists in the Caribbean. He's on the IPCC and so forth, old Caribbean guy, and then Dr. Bino, who's the younger guy on that project. I walked in, they looked at me and said, well, where's the wedding? You know, like that was the joke. They made a joke. They said, well, where's the wedding? So I told that story during this presentation right off the bat, because in this presentation room, which is at a resort here in St. Lucia, when I walked in yesterday, like I tend to show up a day early for these kind of things, I walked in and they had like white drapes over all the chairs. They had ribbons hanging. Like, it looked like we were going to have a wedding the next day, you know, literally. So I just thought it was funny because the first time I went to the Caribbean, I was overdressed, and this time I think I was dressed perfectly for this presentation. I walked in, I got a nice blue, like St. Lucia blue tie, and I mean, it was just like an icebreaker that it worked like a charm. So even in the language you'll see here in this presentation, I kind of kept it like, you know, common, right? Because you're dealing with a lot of different people, some of whom are, you know, just operational folks and maybe don't know a lot about sustainable development. So our first operational directive for this approach, I said just our approach was to keep it real, meaning focus on practicality. And I find this a lot in this kind of work internationally. You get in some meetings, like when I was at the UN meetings for biodiversity in the early part of July, I mean, you get the high-level talks, it's blah, blah, blah about mainstreaming and transformational change and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, God, what are you going to do? Like, please explain to me in plain English what exactly you're going to do for the next 6 months on your work plan. So in our case here, from day one, we kept it very real, like very practical and very focused on implementation. How are people going to use this and where are they going to derive benefit? So we also maintained a laser focused on data. And this is kind of a running theme in my work anyway, where I want to see, even in anything, in any policy initiative, I want to see evidence. I'd like to see, I mean, we've got feedback on the assignments. I'm saying, give me proof of what you're saying, like defend what you're saying with some solid background. And it's no different in this. If we're designing a platform for monitoring environmental quality and reporting, we want to make sure we have excellent data to substantiate any claims that St. Lucia is going to make to either of these UN conventions. Next, we dug deep into the reporting requirements and data use. We really, really took a deep dive into the reports and analyzed them very, very thoroughly. This is a 1.5 to 2 year project. Formulate effective and informative indicators, core and overall. So we wanted to choose indicators that made sense, that were going to actually make sense, not only for the reporting requirements, but for how they govern their country, right? Like, how do they deal with invasive species? How do they deal with loss of biodiversity? How do they deal with land degradation? We need to have solid indicators with good data that make a lot of sense. We also took a bottom-up and top-down approach and meet in the middle. So what this means is, bottom-up means starting with ground-level data assessment. So the first thing we did during the inception period was took a tour of the island, got in a truck with their chief forestry officer, and we drove around the island and looked at key different areas in the island to see where there was problems. And that was mostly focused on land degradation, but we were looking at everything. So we really looked right on the ground at this stuff all around the island before we even got into any review of the reports. Then top down, I worked a fair bit with the conventions. At the conventions, So I was dealing directly with the CBD and the UNCCD as well as with the UNFCCC and the people that work on reporting for those conventions. So finding out what they're looking for, right? So that is like a top-down as well as bottom-up approach. And if you translate that into, say, organizational SEA, that would mean working with people who are working in the field on what you're dealing with. Let's just say you're working in a forestry company. You want to work with people that are out there monitoring, right? And then also you want to work with the management and executive team who are looking at this from a mile-high view. In this case, we're dealing with the executive secretary and the team of people looking at how to implement the convention. So that would be at the CBD, the UNFCCC, and UNCCD. So I would deal with all those folks, and I know who those folks are. But then translate that into how do you actually monitor and achieve what you're trying to set out at the convention level in a country like St. Lucia, but what data do you need? You see what I'm saying? So you have like this bottom-up high-level stuff, but then you have really ground-level assessment, and you try and find a way to match data to policy. That's our job. And make the indicators, presentation of information, and function of the EIS very intuitive, clean, and easy to understand. Now this is another more of a design directive that we took because I can't stand these systems. I was trained in this stuff starting, way back in the 90s, I suppose, where you'd have like really, really crappy user interfaces. Like the user interface, even NASA was notoriously bad for this. They had like terrible user interfaces for remote sensing software when you want to download remotely sensed data. Awful, really hard to understand. So what I wanted to avoid with this, unfortunately we're in a state now where you can do, the technology now you can do a good user interface fairly easily, you get a good design and so forth. So we really stressed that. Made it clean and simple and easy to use. So my job here is to make sure people understand, like these stakeholders understand that we're really doing our job. Like that's as a practitioner, you want to make sure it's like just ensuring that people know that you've put the right work in to come up with the right solutions for your job, for this contract. So here I wanted to literally show that we have been actively participating at the upper level, like at the top-down level, so working with the convention. So I showed this photo here, which is a shot taken in September 9th, 2017 in Mongolia. So this is in Ordos, Inner Mongolia, from the UNCCD COP. It's a Conference of the Parties for the UN Convention for Combating Desertification, where I was invited to present our work in this area to the plenary on what's called the CRIC, the Committee for Reporting and Implementation of the Convention. So this is the part where people look at indicators, reporting, and so forth for UNCCD. So I showed this photo, and everybody's like, "Oh my, okay, you guys are really involved with this unit." It's like those who are unfamiliar with DE and with me and with what we're doing. This is another shot. That's me up there. This tiny guy in the far left, talking about environmental monitoring and how we've gone about doing that in St. Lucia for the UNCCD. So you're establishing credibility when you do something like this, which, this isn't gratuitous, it's legitimate, right? So this next shot here I showed was from July 12th, so that's a few weeks ago, at the Convention for Biodiversity's SBI meetings. Now I told you about this. This is a subsidiary body for implementation. So this is where all the parties come for the Biodiversity Convention. This is in Montreal, where we talk about, well, how's it going for implementing the convention? Things like reporting, things like indicators, things like new policy initiatives, and so forth. But I wanted to show this to say, look, we're in the game and we're getting up to speed and keeping our finger on the pulse of reporting for these conventions, because you need to do that. It's always changing. When you have 196 different countries trying to achieve the same objective, it's not a static process, right? There's politics involved, there's money involved, there's innovation involved, all this kind of new technology, new science. I mean, gene banking is a huge issue right now with CBD. So I wanted to show, like, look, we are engaged, and this is how it informs our process for telling you how this system is going to work. So our results I went into. First and foremost, we gained a deep understanding of detailed reporting requirements for the CBD, the 3 conventions, and we felt we designed a reporting system to satisfy those objectives. Secondly, we did through detailed assessment of the data required to support the indicators, we did an environmental data gap analysis that really showed where they're strong, this country, St. Lucia, is strong, and where they're deficient. So we did a big report saying, look, this is all good, but this stuff needs work. We shortlisted a set of very important core indicators. So those core indicators are really, well, I'll show you in the system, coming up what we built the system around. And then we created a matrix that maps national and regional data sources to those core indicators. So with those core indicators established, we showed them where that data is coming from in some cases, like where they're currently reporting, and where they could get data where there's a shortage, right? And then we forged good relationships with those working internationally at the convention. So I showed you in those photos, we work directly with those responsible for reporting and indicators at the conventions, with the view to ensuring that there's continuity between state level and international policies for business and for policy, like for governance. So that there's continuity between what the international level is saying we should do and what the state level is, what's happening at the state level. And there's a big disconnect between those two things. There's these aspirational goals from the international level, and you hear this one, like, oh my gosh, that's fantastic. We want to go and, you know, I don't know, achieve these targets. You're talking the SDGs, or achieve the HE targets for biodiversity. And then you look at the state level and you have like really no data to support any kind of progress they're making. So we wanted to see that there's a connection between those two things, and we've strived to do that with this project. And then lastly, produce a solid and effective environmental information system, what we're calling CDSF, which is a common data storage facility, which is like basically an online portal for data. So this is what we came up with, and I'll show you some screenshots and just basically the structure. So we have here a CDSF, which is the CDSF is where you get a lot of the kind of the core users. These are people at ministries and so forth that will be pumping data into this. So like reports, they'll be putting in data, like tabular data, they'll put in GIS data and so forth, and they will then put in the metadata, they'll catalog it, and it goes into the CDSF, and they'll be curated so people will review it to make sure it's quality or not. And then once it's verified, boom, it gets pushed to the NEIS, the National Environmental Information System. And that's where you can query it. And the NES is open to everybody. It's an open data platform where even like NGOs, the common public, can go in and see what the greenhouse gas emissions are for St. Lucia. Like you can query and see what progress has been made between, say, 2000 and 2010, right? Which is great. You know, I don't think Canada does this, to be honest with you. I haven't seen many countries that do see that, because what that does, it liberates the data, it opens it, and it allows kind of people to really understand how they're doing as a country with respect to their progress for certain objectives, right? It's being transparent is what it is. So this is a screenshot then of the actual NEIS. So you can see St. Lucia's National Environmental Information System. It just shows, you know, it's exploring reports, the MEAs that we're dealing with. We chose 3 to start with because we need to manage the scope, but they're signed on to at least, I think, 10 MEAs. These are things like the Ramsar Convention for Wetlands, CITES for illegal trade of endangered species, the Montreal Protocol for ozone. There's a lot of different MEAs that they're signed on that require reporting, and this is going to help them with that. So this is what you do. You go into the system, you log on or go into the website, and then you can choose the MEA that you're dealing with, like CBD, UNCCD, whatever, and then it will give you a list of categories of the different data sets that you can look at. And then once you choose your indicator, so this is kind of hard to see, you can do a report, and this one is for UNFCCC, no, this is for protected areas. So this is for UNCCD, and looking at the amount of area of protected areas. How much that is. So you can go in and you click on this and do a report on what is the status of protected areas in St. Lucia. You can choose different parameters within, and it'll show you then a graph, like a pie chart or a graph or whatever, of data that is verified and live. You can also look at the data geospatially. So this will show you the same data, protected areas, but it shows you where these types of protected areas are, like a nature conserve or a marine protected area, what have you. These are the different categories. And it will show you, the previous table is showing the aerial extent of each type of protected area. This is showing you exactly where that protected area is. And all of this stuff you can download. So you can log onto this, and if you want to download that GIS data, boom, you just press a key and it will, or press a button and it will download that geospatial data, and you can then use that in QGIS or ARC or whatever you're using. So it's very, or if you want the tabular data, you can download that. If you want the figure, like the pie chart, you can download that. Any areas that have cultural protection? Yes, there are. So there's ones there that are culturally significant areas. So I think I'm not sure if it's an actual UN. So a good example of that is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, right? So that's a perfect example of culturally protected areas. And I believe, I'm not sure if it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site here. Actually, I think there is. Yes, I'm pretty sure Pigeon Island. So Pigeon Island, which is not far from where I am, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, I believe, because it's culturally significant. It has unique biota and so forth. For many other areas in the world, you have UNESCO World Heritage Sites, some of which differ, but that's the type of thing you would include. You'd have like a geospatial delineation of where your UN World Heritage Site is. Yeah. So that we went through, and there's more to that than that. I'm not showing it all there, but that's kind of the gist of what the system is, right? So you take all the data that relates to those different conventions and other ones, and your average person can go on and look at those maps and look at those figures. It will all be validated, like validated data, so it's not going to be fictional. It's all going to be like solid, real stuff. And so any person can go on and say, well, what are we doing for greenhouse gas emissions? You can see all of the different types of greenhouse gas emissions that they have. So everything ranging from transportation to HFCs to what else? Emissions from infrastructure, all that kind of stuff, broken down as it would be delineated in the reports that they give to the UNFCCC. So the key here is collaboration, so transparency and sharing of data. And they're making huge steps in that regard. They just signed a legal agreement for data sharing amongst Caribbean nation states. So there's a lot of progress happening there. And Canada is quite ambitious about that agenda as well. It's different working here though, because the governments tend to be small. I mean, you've got like a small country here, so you can have a little more agility. You don't have to like deal with all these different groups like a bigger government where you have bigger stakes. So our next steps for this, to establish the online platform, that's where we're at. This is the last step of this project. We're about 70% done. And then we've compiled the data, we established the online system, we've developed manuals. We are then in the process of training, EIS database management training, and then comments on feedback, and we're doing the training tomorrow. So that's what I'll be doing tomorrow with our partners, is going through and walking people through how to upload the data, what kind of data we want, all that kind of stuff. That's 2 days of data training and then 1 day on Thursday of system admin training. I won't be as involved in that because that's more the technical folks. And then there's a 12-month warranty period. So what are the implications for something like this? Well, first and foremost, we have, as it was initially set out in the terms of reference when we started, St. Lucia's MEA reporting and environmental monitoring is poised to improve. We feel that we have designed something and gone through all of the reporting and SEA-related, CEA-related documentation to create something that we feel can move them forward, and that was what our objective was from day one. Secondly, the message from the MEA secretariats is that they want more systematic and efficient reporting. Right, so this is a comment that's coming from a woman named Monique Barbeau, who is the executive secretary of the UNCCD. So executive secretary means she's the head, so she'd be like the president, the head, the big cheese from the UN Convention for Combating Desertification. At the COP, she has repeatedly said that they want to get systematic and efficient reporting that's one click. Boom, you get this. It's not going to be one click, but as much as possible to get this reporting more systematized. Why? Because you've got 196 countries that are all reporting on one convention to achieve one goal. Like in the case of the UNCCD, one goal is to achieve land degradation neutrality by the year 2030, so net zero land degradation. So if you're trying to achieve that, you need to have consistent data across the board. So you need the different parties to be using comparable data. And so this is why it needs to be systematic. Someone is messing around with the slides, it's not me. So that's what we're setting out to do. So, and we're doing that. So this allows for systematic data analysis and very efficient use of data, right? Because it's easy to use. You can upload data quite easily. Whoever's doing that, please stop. It's not me. Okay. So the EIS and CDSF set the stage for mainstreaming progress on these indicators to different spheres in society. So this is, I wanted to stress here that this is not just about government agencies, because quite often it is. Quite often these projects, it's for just government, and then quite often even when the funding runs out or the project's done, it just kind of gets shelved. Whereas in this case, it's not going to get shelved. They're excited about this, they're excited about the next steps, and in addition, they're excited to get other groups using it. So like private sector using this for EIAs and SEAs, right? It's open. You can use this for doing strategic environmental assessments or environmental impact assessments. Youth, they want youth to be engaged with this platform. They also want civil society and NGOs to be engaged with this platform. This kind of opens the discussion about environmental assessment, because we're not always going to agree on things, right? Like the NGOs, like the Greenpeaces of the world, and the David Suzuki Foundations of the world will not agree with certain development decisions the government may be taking, like in Canada with the Kinder Morgan Pipeline Extension Project, right? But at least if you have these platforms in place where you have the impact data laid out so people can query it and look at it, at least that creates a framework for people to have a discussion around what the impacts are and what the data tells us, right? And you have to, as a government, you have to be very brave and kind of, I guess, you have to open yourself to criticism in order to do that. And you have to be transparent and you have to be honest. And I'm not sure that's happening in Canada, to be honest, but it's happening here. I know that. I'm involved with the process in St. Lucia. We've designed the platform for them to do that, and I'm sure they're gonna really uptake this from what I'm seeing. Fourthly here, the Executive Secretary of the ES of the CBD, so the Convention for Biodiversity, called for, and this was a few weeks ago, transformative change. So this is the buzzword right now for biodiversity and ecosystems, is transformative, I'll get to that question in one sec, transformative change, the way we deal with ecosystems and biodiversity. Basically, we need to change the game with respect to how we're impacting biodiversity and ecosystems, and the way to do that is through mainstreaming policy, so taking conservation and sustainable use policy from the CBD and bringing it into decision making. It's called mainstreaming. And in order to do that, you need to have management tools. You need to have environmental management tools, right? So this platform is an environmental management tool. It's a data management platform and tool that can be used with policy to help them monitor and make educated decisions about things such as development policy, right? Or disaster response, disaster risk reduction, or greenhouse gas emissions, right? So this transformative change is a high-level word that they use at these, at the UN COP meetings. It's like, well, we need this. It's like, well, fine, okay, well, here you go. This is going to be a tool that can help to foster transformative change for this country. I will stand behind that. So I've been the architect of the system with my partners. So most importantly, we have an opportunity, is what I left. This is how I left it, is there's an opportunity to show the world that it's not the size of the country that counts, but the depth of its will and commitment to realize sustainable development. That's the important part. We're talking about a country of 180,000 people population. It's very small, right? Yet, they have invested their efforts, their will, their commitment, their ambition to do what other countries in the world, including Canada, are not doing, which is engage in environmental management tools, development and implementation that can really start to measure evidence-based policy to achieve sustainable development, to achieve carbon neutrality, to achieve land degradation neutrality, to achieve better resilience to climatic change, sea level rise, as well as frequency of storms. Like, these are things that need to happen, but you need to do it in such a way that you can measure quantifiably your progress. And this is what these folks are doing. So I wanted to give them credit because, they are not like, a Canada. They're not a United States. They don't have like millions of dollars to invest in all this stuff. They have modest funds and modest means, yet they're punching way above their weight, right? And I wanted to leave them that to say this is something that you should be proud of. So that is the end of this presentation. And those questions don't apply. So questions. First question here is this a trend amongst island nations? I'd say it is, yes, because we started on this kind of work in 2012 where we did something similar for the whole Caribbean region. and that was with the group that I mentioned before, which is the 5 Cs, the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. We developed something called CREAD, which is a Caribbean Regional Environmental and Atmospheric Database Management System. It was a system for monitoring the environment of the whole Caribbean. And that was the start of where I started to see this kind of the movement towards open data. Things such as GeoNode and so forth, where agencies would submit their data to a central repository and then allow other people to use it. So I think it is a trend amongst island nations because I see funding going into this. So this funding comes from the GEF. It's not from St. Lucia's pocket. It's from the global, it's from the international community that funds this type of work. So yeah, I see this as a growing trend. In fact, I see it, we'll see more and more of this. And we'll see more sophisticated stuff. So for instance, we've talked about, well, I don't know if we've talked about it much in 660, but in 322 we've talked about economic valuation of environmental services, right? So how would you go about doing that? Well, you need data, right? So we're poised to do that kind of work in St. Lucia now with this system. We'll have really good biodiversity and ecosystem data that we can start to look at economic valuation, cost-benefit analysis, payment for ecosystem services, all that kind of stuff, which is progressive, really progressive stuff in this area. So yeah, I see it as a trend amongst island nations, and I would see St. Lucia as a leader in this right now in the Caribbean. I'm not so sure about the South Pacific. When does this project end? Is this model feasible to Canada? Why not? I think so. I don't see why it can't be used in Canada. We have the same, we're a signatory to the CBD, right? We do the same reports. We've re-engaged with the UNCCD. We were out of the UNCCD for a while, and then we've got back in the game with UNCCD. We're in the game with UNFCCC. We're in the climate change game. We've signed on to that convention, the Paris Agreement, and so forth. So why not? I think we should. I mean, the question is will. It's political will, right? These people have the political will to do it. Canada is moving very slow. I'm actually really disappointed with Canada. I think, we talk a huge game, that's for sure. I see it. I saw it at the SBI, blah, 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 blah. I saw it at the Paris COP and climate change in 2016. I was there and heard this, Canada's back. Well, if Canada's back, why don't you do this? Like St. Lucia's back. St. Lucia never left the table. Like, they don't come out and say these outlandish things. You do not see a country like St. Lucia come out and make outlandish remarks at conference of parties. They don't do that. They come in and they do their stuff and they show everybody what they're doing. That's very simple. So if you're going to talk a big game, you got to deliver. And these guys are delivering. And they've got like way less resources than we have to devote to this type of work. Is this model feasible in Canada? Yes. When does this project end? Well, technically, we're at the end of this phase of the project. So we have to do the training over the next couple days and the wrap-up. And then they're going to move into deployment, right? So we have to figure out that next stuff. So that's why I'm here, is to say, okay, finish it, bang, deliver strong, which I think we did that today. I feel like I got good feedback from people. I felt it was well received. And now we talk about the next phases of things. So this is mapping out work plans and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, we're in a transition period into getting this thing being used. Garbage in, garbage out. If you design the best system in the world, if you don't have good data and good engagement with the users, then it will not work that well. So we need to, it's a very important next stage. Brian, it has to be a priority for it to be actionable. Of course, yeah, it certainly has to be a priority. This has to be made a priority. In any country, it has to be a priority. Now, it's easier, I think, for a country such as St. Lucia to make this a priority because the consequences are much greater for them. If they don't have these systems in place for managing risk, I would say the impacts can be greater because, for instance, if you don't have resilient agriculture and a hurricane comes in, or a drought, or whatever, flood, an inundation, man, your country can go down, right? Like your whole industry can collapse. So they need to be aware of those risks. That's part of it is necessity. The other part of it is opportunity, right? So St. Lucia is in a different position than a country like Canada because they're a recipient country. If you want to look at the global game of environmental policy and development, they are the type of country that qualifies for receiving GEF funding for projects. So what they want to do is they want to do good work and hire good groups to do this stuff and demonstrate that they can move the agenda forward. And therefore, once they do that, they then become a much more welcome country for groups like the JEF and the UN Environment to say, holy cow, we really want to support what these folks are doing because they're doing such a good job of what what we want the world to do. These folks are doing it. So I guarantee you, like coming out of this, there will be some buzz in the UN system about what St. Lucia is doing. So I mean, this isn't just me saying, look, it's great. It's like this is a collective project with a very good group of people in St. Lucia and the ministry working with this. They'll be asked to present what they're doing, and I think other countries will look. Other countries now are currently in the Caribbean are looking to what we're doing for St. Lucia. We're proposing to look at this across the OECS and other countries and so forth. So it's it's a template for doing similar types of approaches in other parts. So that then speaks to the SEA question or CEA issues that we deal with in 660. Once you have this kind of like platforms in place and you're collecting the data, then you can start to look at kind of impacts over different scales. At the nation scale, you can look at the project scale for an EIA, you get the nation scale for an SEA, then you can look at SEA across a region, like saying regional impacts of climate change across the Eastern Caribbean, right? Let's just say you have Trinidad and Tobago, you have Barbados, you have St. Lucia, and you have Dominica, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. You have all of those countries having this kind of system in place. You take that data, you aggregate it together, and you say, oh, okay, well, this is what's happening to biodiversity across these island nations because of, say, droughts or storms or what have you. So that's kind of getting into a broader type of SEA type of question, which tends to be, as you know, having looked at the readings, it's for policy plans and programs. Any other questions? No questions? Who inputs data other than the government? Well, currently right now, that's a good question. We'll have to see how that goes because potentially NGOs, could potentially the private sector as well. The thing is, with any project like this, you have to ensure data quality. So you can't just make it an open platform where people can throw data up there. There has to be some form of data curation where people look at the data. There's a process for uploading the data where you have to tag everything and put the appropriate metadata and make sure it's properly documented. That's an important step. Currently, what we'll be doing tomorrow, for instance, is working with representatives. There will be 20 people in session tomorrow morning. I think we're doing morning and afternoon, so there's 20 and 20. 20 in the morning, I think 20 in the afternoon, and then there's another day. So we'll have 20 representatives from different government agencies primarily. So these will be people from forestry, from agriculture, from NEMO, National Emergency Management Office. You'll get people from Central Statistics. We'll get people from who else will we have there? Risk Environment, Sustainable Development. So these guys are gatekeepers. Yes and no. I mean, like in Canada or like any other country, you'll have operational staff in any agency that are responsible for, say, taking metadata. And they are the ones who will be having the data, gathering the data in their own jurisdiction. And then we're going to train them how to take that data and upload it to the system and properly document it. So there'll probably be another step where there'll be a curatorial individual or group that will look at all of this data coming in and ensure that it's kind of like it's cohesive and it's properly entered. There'll be a QA process. But we're just entering into this, so I can't really say exactly how that's going to go. So we'll be doing training tomorrow with that, and then we'll go from there. But typically, that's how you do it. You'd have authorized personnel. Especially for uploading data, you have to be an authorized user to access the CDSF and then upload the data. Otherwise, it can turn into like a dog's breakfast. Unknown unknowns. Yep. Yeah. So there we go. This is happening right now. It's kind of cool, and looking forward to getting it mobilized. It's always, and once we get data flowing in, that's when you start to see really cool stuff happen. But we had a lot of media today. A lot of media folks from different TV stations and all that kind of stuff. It was a big deal. It was pretty fun. The launch was great. I don't know if any of you follow me on Instagram. If you want to see that, go to my Instagram account. I'll just put it in here. If you go on Insta and then follow that, you'll see I did like an Insta video of the launch, like actually the minister did this really cool thing with the cell phone. They had this thing where you take a cell phone and put it over a QR code and it accesses the website. And then she with on the cell phone pressed the launch, like the launch thing, and then it just made everything active. Boom, like it went live as soon as she did that. And then everybody was watching, and they had like cameras and flashes going off and stuff. It was cool. They did a really good job with the launch. Like you want to make it an event, right? We're launching the National Environmental Information System. Come one, come all. And the TV stuff were there, and then she did it, and boom, the screen lit up. Like the big screen lit up with the national information. It just went live right there, which was neat. It was cool. It was like it was kind of like they kind of captured that moment. It's like shooting the SpaceX rocket, right? It's boom, it goes up in space. It was kind of like not quite as, I'm not saying this was as eventful as launching a rocket in space, but I mean they managed to make putting a website up on the internet like an event through an action, through our presentations and so forth. It was kind of cool. They did a great job. So this is kind of an example, is exemplifying what you need to do strategic environmental assessment. The kind of tools you need in terms of software to provide data to do something like that effectively. So what's neat about that is that going forward, there's a bunch of interesting research that can be done. There's a bunch of interesting, actually, like just assessments that can be done, and even economics and so forth. There's a chief economist was there today, and she got all excited about seeing the data. So it's kind of cool. It's great. So, in conclusion, this is, as we say at Rural Roads, live your learning, right? We're not all about like reading academic papers and then writing academic papers and doing statistics and measuring stuff and then like coming to conclusions or what have you. We're about studying things and understanding things and then going out there in the world and doing it, living our learning. So I think this is an example of that. I would stand by that. So in your own sphere of influence, where you work and the activities you're engaged in just in your life, this is the type of thing that you can do. You can take your knowledge and your skills and put it to work to help to move the agenda forward, whatever the objective is that you're trying to do. In our case, it's sustainable development, but it could be any other agenda as well, if you're interested in other issues. Just be careful when you do it, though, because if you start criticizing countries like Saudi Arabia, they might bite you right back. If you've read the news about that. I worked with the Saudis from 2001 to 2004, so I've had a fair bit of exposure to how they work. And this is for Prince Sultan, for a science center we designed way back, and when all this stuff went down, I just wasn't surprised. They don't take criticism lightly. And I'm not saying they don't deserve criticism for some of the things they do, for sure, but there's a way to do it and there's a way not to do it. And yeah, you'll be careful. International relations is tricky. Like I wouldn't come here to St. Lucian, tell them that they're doing all things wrong, and then expect them to welcome me back to their country. What I did do was I forgot my ties. When I was coming from Montreal here, I forgot. I just left my ties in my closet there. And I figured this was one of the events you want to wear a tie to for this presentation. So I went out yesterday and I bought a cerulean blue tie. It's cerulean, I think. Cerulean blue. It's a light blue, and it's the color of the country. It's St. Lucia's, this light blue, their flag. If you look at St. Lucia's flag, it's this light blue kind of aqua blue type of color. So I went out and I found a cerulean blue tie. It was cheap, actually. It's inexpensive, and got it. And the first thing I walked into the tie, the permanent secretaries, I love your tie. It's like instant brownie points. It was quite funny. But I mean, it's about like paying respect to their country as well, right? This is a big deal for them as a country, and they're very proud of the work that they're doing. So at the very least I can do is pay respect to their initiatives, which is this is their nation building. We're just helping to contribute to it. All right. So unless there's any questions, I'm gonna cue the music. There's some steel drum. Now you can go get some punch. Get a bit of rum. And relax. Thanks for coming out.